All right. We got about halfway through chapter 13 last week. Chapter 13 is dealing with the problem of evil. And this is an important chapter. All these chapters are important, especially given the fact that this is one of the reasons why people sometimes bring up the reason why they don't follow the Bible or they don't believe in God or whatnot, because if there was really a loving God, why would evil exist in the world? And so Doy has kind of dealt with this. He looked at this from a biblical perspective, looking at Gideon and Habakkuk, both who both asked the question, you know, how long will you let evil continue and so forth. We talked about Job last week. He talks about evil versus the attributes of God, and that this is where kind of the specifics of the attributes of God being all powerful, all loving, and all good, kind of people perceive a contradiction between the issue of evil and these characteristics of God. However, as we talked about at the end of last week, we noted the fact that there's a lot of things that sometimes happen that we have no frame of reference to be able to articulate why God allows certain things to take place. And as with the example of Job, we recognize that Job, at least according to what we don't read, was never told that Satan had challenged the faith of Job and that God allowed Satan to do that to show that Job would be faithful. Instead, Job had to continue and understand that, you know what? It's okay that I don't know why these things are allowed to happen. Instead, what is important is that I remain faithful. And that's what Job learned, and to trust the wisdom of God. And I think that that's very specific for us, that we recognize that there are so many things that are taking place beyond our ability to perceive. Again, we talked about Peter and the fact that specifically, in Luke 22, where Jesus tells Peter that Satan has asked for you, that he may sift you as wheat. This is when Peter says, I'm willing to die for you, Jesus. And then, of course, Jesus says, well, the rooster will crow 3 times, or you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. But, you know, whether or not that same exact thing happens today, does Satan go and request to test or tempt or try us, challenge our faith? I don't know if that same thing happens like it did with Job and apparently with Peter today, but certainly we are tempted and tried, and certainly there is opportunity of suffering that comes about because of that. And so as we move into the second half of chapter 13, Doy's going to bring up 2 main issues that are going to be key components of addressing the issue or the problem of evil. One is going to be free will. The other is going to be the justice of God. So, keep in mind that our knowledge is limited. God may very well have many purposes for allowing things to be a certain way that are beyond our ability to comprehend. And I think that's an important point to make, especially when people start questioning, well, why would God allow this and why would God allow that? Obviously, there are some things that we can speculate and we can say, well, you know, some good can come from this, and certainly the example of the faithful can be a good thing that can come from bad situations. But as far as why does God allow certain things to happen, you know what? Not only are we not capable of really understanding the answer to those questions, the lesson that Job learned is we don't have the right to question the wisdom of God. Now, that's not a cop-out. I think some people would chalk that's just a cop-out. Well, we're not allowed to question. But that's ultimately what Job learned, was that God's wisdom is so far above my own, I have asked those things which are too wonderful for me to know. Okay, I am not allowed, I'm not capable, but I'm also not, it's not within my right or authority to ask those questions. And so it really is about appreciating and respecting God's wisdom. But to that end, we talk about free will. Suffering entered the world through abused free will, Adam and Eve. Going all the way back to the garden, of course, the serpent played a role there, but ultimately, Adam and Eve had one job, not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they made the choice, regardless of being tricked and deceived, they made the choice to eat of that tree. Okay, and as a result, we all suffer the consequences of that sin, don't we? Do we suffer the guilt of that sin? No. Okay, there's a very big difference between saying I suffer the guilt of their sin versus saying I suffer the consequence of their sin. And the difference is inherited sin, as the Catholic Church and many other Christian religions teach of innate sinfulness within man, or inherited sin and that sort of thing. We don't inherit the sin of Adam and Eve. We do inherit the consequence. As a result, obviously, we don't live in the Garden of Eden, and obviously the tree of life is not available, and as a result, we do die physically. Also, sin entered the world, so we can die spiritually. So obviously, all of those consequences came as a result of Adam and Eve's choices. And then Doi quotes Plantinga when he says, the fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness. For he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good. I think that's kind of an interesting quote, that in order for God to have prevented sin from entering the world, what would he have done? What would he have had to have done? To prevent sin from entering the world, what would God had to have done? Huh?
Prevent good from entering the world.
Well, okay, prevent good from entering the world, or prevent Adam and Eve from having the choice or the freedom to choose whether good or bad. Okay? He would have to infringe upon the free will of man to make a choice. And if he did that, yes, that would forestall the entrance of moral evil, but then you and I wouldn't be able to choose to be good either. And I think that this is a very important point, and ultimately kind of a very hinge-worthy point here. We often suffer for personal wrong choices that we make. Okay, we know that consequences from our actions, consequences of sin. Okay, David certainly dealt with his own personal consequences for his sins, but then also others are often affected and suffer by the choices that we make. That emphasizes the harm and the danger of bad choices and sinful choices. But then thirdly, as Doi points out, even future generations will be affected by the choices that we make. That shows how, just think about Lot and his two daughters, and how the Moabites and the Ammonites came from the choices that those two young ladies made. Okay, and how future generations, entire nations of Israel and the Moabites and the Ammonites were constantly going at it. Okay, the Ammonites and the Moabites were thorns in Israel's side for generations because of the choices those two young ladies made with Lot. And so we can see that play out in the Old Testament, seeing how our choices can affect future generations down the road. So the question that Doi posits is, why would God make us to have free will if it invites suffering? And he said, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is no free will at all. And of course, there are some who argue that free will is an illusion anyway. But that would basically make us robots. Unfeeling robots. Because the choice to love, in fact, kind of the point that Doi's going to kind of hinge everything on is God's love and then man's ability to love in return. But if we don't have that free will, then we're just really going through the motions, deceiving ourselves that we love God or that we love our neighbor, and that it's not real free will at all. And so that's what Doi's point is that the alternative would be we would just be going through the motions, doing what we're programmed to do. We were created in God's image. And of course, there's a lot of components to that. And Doi even mentions the fact that there's likely even more components to that than we're capable of fully understanding. But one aspect of God's image is that God loves, and he can love unconditionally. And he proved that by sending his son to die. So how can we be in his image if we don't have the capacity to choose love? There's no such thing as forced love. You can't force that. True self-sacrificial love is not something that is forced or driven. It's something that is chosen. And as a result, just as God chose to love us, he has given us the ability to love him in return. And I think that's a very interesting point about the concept of free will, focusing on, again, it's not just the emotion of love, but that full self-sacrificial submission to, for instance, God or to our neighbor. Thoughts or comments through that? All right, so then Doy counters this or adds to this the issue of the justice of God. So because God is holy and just, he cannot ignore the problem of sin. There must be consequences for sin. Sin is not just the breaking of rules, it is a violation of the very nature and character of God. What does Paul say in Romans 3:23? We have all sinned and fallen short of what? The rules of God? The glory of God. Yes, we've broken his rules or commandments, but associated with that is the fact that sin is the opposite of the character of God. And if we are to claim to be his children, if we're to claim to be followers of Christ, we must reflect his character, his image in us. Sin is the antithesis to that. It's the opposite. And so sin is the violation of the very nature and character of God. And because of the nature of God, there will be a day of reckoning for all sin and evil. And so the end of this point that Doy makes is, okay, people ask the question, why hasn't God taken care of evil? Well, when you read from Genesis through Revelation, has God physically at times dealt with evil? Has he done something about it? Has he punished peoples and nations because of evil?
Ask the Egyptians.
Oh yeah, ask the Egyptians. Yeah, ask the army that was submerged, right? Ask Pharaoh. Okay, yeah, he has done something physically at times over the issue of sin and evil. But even perhaps more importantly, is he going to do something about it? Yes. Okay, ultimately the day of judgment, that will be the final, that will be the exclamation mark, end of evil. And so when people say, why doesn't God do something now? Well, you're putting God into the man's time idea of time and idea of lifespans and so forth, when God has promised that there will be a day he will bring all evil to a reckoning, to a judgment. And he's raised Jesus from the dead and guaranteed that day will happen, Acts chapter 17, in which all will be judged. So, anything through the justice of God? All right, so the last two paragraphs of chapter 13, kind of his conclusions. Given that all have violated the character of God through sin, the real question is not so much why God allows good people to suffer. And that's where people get hung up, right? Why would God allow good people or moral people to suffer evil? Here's the real question. I think it's a beautiful point that he makes here. Why does God do anything kind for bad people? And we're not talking about morally evil or wicked people. We are bad people because of sin. Yet God has shown and continues to show mercy and compassion. And I think that's a beautiful point to make when people say, well, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Why does God do good things or kind things for evil people, sinful people? We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And what did God do while we were yet sinners, Romans 5? He sent his son to die. God so loved the world. Why does he do this? Because of his great love for us. I think that's a beautiful way of reframing the thought. That it's as if on the one hand you've got God who's being mean or ornery because he's not providing immediate justice or preventing bad things from happening. But even the best of us, the most righteous of us, or the holiest of us, can we say we have no sin? No. There is none righteous, no, not one. Okay. Now that's not to say that we can't be pure and holy through the blood of Christ and then live faithfully, but the point is that we've all sinned. We have all required the love of God being shown through His Son, through the blood of Jesus, to forgive us of our sins. So ultimately, who did the first wrong here? Okay, and I'm not saying God did any wrong, but where did the first wrong come from? Was it God? Or was it man? Not only did man do the first wrong to God, okay, man sinned in the garden, thus sin entered the world, but man has done the first wrong to fellow man. As far as we know, the first recorded wrong against another person was when? Cain and Abel. Yeah, Cain and Abel. Okay, and so you have these things that happen because of our choices we made. And so the issue here really revolves around, I think this is a very important question maybe to ask somebody when they ask, well, why does God allow these terrible things to happen? What would you have God do? That would be my question in response. What do you want God to do? Do you want God to physically stop a murderer from murdering? Do you want someone who's a thief to quit from robbing? Is God going to physically stop him? Is he going to snap his fingers and just kill him? Is God going to call 911 ahead of time so that they can prevent this from happening? Do you want God to snap his fingers and make a hurricane all of a sudden just disappear? What do you want God to do aside from either infringing our free will or infringing on the natural laws God has ordained to be on the earth? What do you want him to do? Because if he infringes upon our free will to do evil, then what's going to be the issue? What's the problem with that? If God prevents people from ever doing anything bad, seems like a great thing.
No love.
There's no love. Okay, we're constantly forced into doing everything the right way, not because we've chosen to do so, but because God is forcing us to do so. And is that what God wants? All those who worship him must worship in forced submission, spirit and in truth.
Let's continue in sin that grace may abound.
Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Romans 6 verse 1. Okay, that's not how God has ordained, first of all, the world to function or us to function, and certainly not how he has set up the plan of salvation either. We have to make the choice. Let's see. On the day of judgment, people will not be pleading for fairness. They will be pleading for mercy. And I think that's an excellent point, is that it's not about fairness. Okay, you're not going to be up at judgment when we all bow before Jesus. We're not going to be pleading to, please be fair, please be fair. No. It's going to be mercy, because people are going to understand and recognize that when they're before the throne of Jesus, that they did wrong. And it's not going to be about fairness. It's going to be about mercy. How will we handle suffering? We can grow through suffering. We can cultivate character, learn patience, gain wisdom and hope, and even help others. We can look beyond this world of suffering, which serves to remind us how ugly sin is. We can look to heaven and the glory and peace that waits there. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
Just jumping back to the previous paragraph, I understand his reframing the question you talked about. And those who are believers, I think, will follow that line.
Yeah.
To me, if there's someone that doesn't believe in God or is a doubter, to reframe the question, why does God do it? Well, that answer to God is love.
Mm-hmm.
The world generally will acknowledge that side of it.
Right.
So to me, to non-believers, I didn't see much strength in that. I mean, for us, it makes sense.
Right.
You believe in God and every part of his character.
Right.
But if you don't, then I don't.
Well, I'm wondering if that's why Doy puts it the way he does, because the argument from a non-believer is, well, if God exists, why does he allow this stuff to happen? To give a believer's perspective to a non-believer that this isn't an issue. The issue isn't, if we're going to say God exists, which this non-believer just posited, if God exists, why does evil allowed to take place? The question isn't about why evil takes place. Why is God so kind to us? because we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So it's almost as if this non-believer's opened that door to encapsulate everything that we claim God is, and we believe God is because of how he presents himself in the Bible, from being this mean and awful God who refuses to do anything about stuff, to being, well, we believe God is love. And if we believe that we are all sinners, and God has shown his love through his Son, why do that? Because of his great love for us. And so, I agree with you, Nolan, that to a non-believer, that question of itself isn't going to do much. I think the point is the contrast if we're talking to a non-believer or somebody who's having issues with their faith, having issues with the issue of evil. Okay, to posit, well, why does God allow this? Okay, well, you've opened the door. Okay, if we're taking God as God presents himself in the Bible, then let's look at this not as God allowing evil, although certainly we can, and Dewey does address that, the issue of free will versus God's justice. But on the flip side, if we're taking everything God is love, and yet we are evil. There's no such thing as good people or moral people in the perspective of needing Christ's sacrifice. Okay, you think of innocence, okay, you can think of innocence like children and that sort of thing. But again, when you're looking at this from the perspective of if something happens to a child, an innocent, what do we know God's going to do? Is he going to take care of that innocent? Yeah, again, that encapsulates that love of God. So to me, I think the counter is not so much to make a non-believer believe, but more so to counter the fact that this isn't an issue for me. Okay, I don't have an issue with the evil of the world because, first of all, we bring about the evil of the world. It has always been man. And secondly, it doesn't bother me because God has shown such love to all of us as human beings. Why would he continue to allow this grace and mercy to us despite our sin? Anything else through that? All right, let's look at our questions for chapter 13. Why is the problem of evil and suffering more than just a philosophical issue? This is something he addresses like in that first introduction paragraph, but this is more than just a philosophical issue. Why? Because it's real. Okay? There is not a single person alive who will not go through suffering, who will not go through trial, who won't go through times of testing and hardship. Every one of us is going to face bad days, bad weeks, bad months, maybe even bad years. Okay? Every one of us. So it's not just some kind of a theoretical thought. This is real. How can we know that we're not alone in feeling the pain of life? And what does biblical history show? How can we know we're not alone? Part of the biblical history that Dewey himself brings up was what? Gideon was an example he brought up. If God is for us, then why have all these things befallen us? Habakkuk asked that question. Job asked, is it wise to allow a righteous man to suffer in this way? Okay, so first of all, we know even people of faith have had these questions. All right? For that matter, people in general have had these questions. Poetry from centuries ago even asked kind of those kinds of questions about why is life this way and so forth. So we know we're not alone, but the biblical narrative helps us to understand how we deal with these things and why it's important for us to be aware of evil and suffering in the world. What attributes of God does the problem of evil primarily strike against? There are three main attributes of God that Dewey deals with. Sorry? His all-knowing, his omniscience, his all-power, okay, his omnipotence. He's omnipresent. Okay, he is everywhere. And certainly that goes into it as well. But he's also omnibenevolent. He's all good. So if he's everywhere, he knows all things, he's all good, and he's all powerful, then the argument about evil is, then how can an all good, all powerful God allow evil to take place? If he's everywhere at all times, he knows when evil's happening or when evil's about to happen. If he's all good, he wouldn't allow these things to happen. So either he's not powerful enough to prevent it, or he's not loving enough to take care of it. That's the point that Doy brings up, is that's too simplistic to consider. That's not the point. But that's the argument that they make. How does that make it a real problem? And that's how. Because if these characteristics are God's, then how do you reconcile the issue of evil with these attributes of God? And so that's why Doy talks about free will and the justice of God. Thoughts or comments with that question? What should we keep in mind about our knowledge and why?
It's limited.
It's limited.
A lot.
Yeah, by 1,000%. And to me, this is a crucial component that a lot of times atheists, agnostics, they don't even consider this concept. And it's kind of funny because a lot of these articles that are coming up, especially recently, these quantum physics and so forth, they're having to rewrite so many laws of nature, having to reconsider the Big Bang because it doesn't fit with what we're observing and so forth. And yet, for this period of time, these were facts. This is how it was in the beginning. This little ball, it blew up and everything formed from that. This is how it was. And now all of a sudden, no, that's not how it was. This is how it was. As if their knowledge is all comprising until it isn't. Okay, and as human beings, sometimes we have the tenacity to think that our observation and our experience can comprise all of knowledge. And that simply isn't the case. And the fact that especially for us, those of us who are believers, recognize there's a spiritual realm beyond what we're able to see. I mean, you think about, I can never remember, is it Elijah or Elisha who prayed that his servant's eyes would be opened? Which one was it? Elisha? You remember? When they were surrounded by the enemies, or the armies of Samaria, I think it was? Or Syria? Syria. They were surrounded by the armies of Syria, and it was either Elijah or Elisha prayed that his servant's eyes be opened, and when they were, he saw the armies of God and his angels and chariots surrounding the armies of Syria. The servant couldn't see it because he was limited by his physical ability to see it. Now, the prophet knew that they were there, whether he was able to see it or not. He knew they were there. And so the idea of this realm beyond what we're capable of seeing, there's so much more to reality than what we are able to understand. Job, and we are given that glimpse, and I'm thankful we are, because it's not just Job, a story of a man who suffered and never got any answers, but was condemned for asking question of, is it wise, for questioning God's wisdom. That would be enough. But the fact that God gives us a glimpse into that realm, to recognize that when you go through trials and sufferings, understand that this isn't just about you. Just like Job had to learn, this isn't about you, Job. Okay, there's a lot more going on than just you. And Job had to understand that in principle, I have asked those things which are too wonderful for me to know. And I think that's a very important point, that we should be humble and recognize that there's so much more that we don't know. Inner workings and interconnectivity. I mean, how does God bring about his providence? You'll never be able to point your finger at a miracle. Because a miracle, how do we define a miracle?
Goes against the nature.
It's
science. Goes against the law of nature.
okay.
Science.
Observable suspension of natural law. Okay, it's observable suspension of natural law. Are there times when people who have stage 4 cancer, especially I've known many Christians who had stage 4 cancer, and over a period of time, maybe they were being treated, maybe they weren't, but then they go in for tests and it's just gone. Okay, it's a miracle. Well, we didn't see it leave. Okay, we didn't see God snap his fingers and the cancer or whatever just disappear. And yet, was God's power involved? Well, yeah. Okay. Providence is the same way. Where can you put your finger and say, there's a miracle that happened right there? You look at Esther and Mordecai. Where was the miracle? Was God's power involved? Yes, absolutely. And I say that to say this. A lot of times the things that we go through provides a kind of a launching point for God's providence to come about, either for us or for others. There have been many examples of suffering brethren whose faith has been so steadfast and stalwart that sometimes as brethren that I've heard about, I've never met, but I've heard about and I recognize their strength, and it gives me strength. Will that brother or sister ever know about it? Maybe not. And yet, through the finding out of those events, that makes me stronger. And so there's so many interconnecting concepts and strings here that it's impossible for us to fully be aware aside from our myopic little slice of life that we have. Any other thoughts or comments through that one?
The quote he had there by the Plantinga,
Yeah.
whoever that. I appreciate it. I'm sure that fellow's 100 times smarter than I am. And he's making an argument of logic to establish a point. But
Right.
when I read in his statement, the trigger word only, the only way God could do something was love.
Yeah.
You know, we don't know. God, he might have done it a second way, 1,000 other ways. I mean, I understand the point he's writing in logic. It just kind of makes me chuckle when a man writes about the only way God could do something was blah, 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 blah.
From man's perspective, yeah.
That we understand or,
Yeah.
or can get.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Again, and to have to preface all of that with saying, kind of like when we talk about the origin of Satan. Okay, to our perspective, there's only 3 possibilities on that, but there may be more that we simply cannot know or understand. Possibilities that go beyond those 3 of our human logic. Okay, and so we have to kind of acknowledge and recognize that there's so much more we don't understand, that to try to limit God arbitrarily, or to say that God, other beyond what he himself has limited himself for. Okay, when God says he cannot be tempted, as is the case in James chapter 1, God himself cannot be tempted with sin. Okay, we know God can't, because he has said so. God cannot lie. Why? Because it's not in God's nature to lie. Okay, so there are certain elements that God himself limits, but our ability or logic to limit, as you did mention with Plantinga, that is kind of one of those things that as far as our perspective goes, the only way he could have prevented moral evil is by preventing moral good. Yeah.
Ever reminded of the passage in the Bible? The secret things belong to God.
Yes.
The things he has revealed, we need to take them and deal with those, or obey those.
Right. Right.
So
Absolutely.
The realm of stuff over here.
We cannot know, and we will not know, and we may never know. And in fact, I have a point about that here in just a minute. What is evil? What can we find, or how can we find a true definition of it? What is evil? A lot of times we picture evil like Hitler and some of the worst people we can think of in the world. What is evil, though? How does the Bible define evil?
Absence of God, in a way.
The absence of God, falling short of the glory of God. And if that's the case, then what is evil? Sin. Yeah, sin is evil. Now, does that mean a person's entire character is evil if they stumble in sin? No, it's not. However, does sin bring about the falling short of the glory of God? Yes, because it's contrary to the character of God. And finding the true definition of it, I think, as Doy pointed out, regarding how that man has fallen short, therefore what does Paul say in Romans 5? We were ungodly. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Okay? That being the case, arbitrarily saying this is what evil is and this is what good is. This goes back to the previous chapter about good and evil and arbitrarily determining morality and so forth. Ultimately, the Bible defines evil as that which is sinful, that which is wrong. We think of Hitler or other examples in history because, again, of the abundance, perhaps, of moral failings. But in the end, in hellfire, you're going to have devil and his angels. We know that. I'm going to posit the probability that Hitler will be there. I'm not the judge. But then, are you also going to have perhaps good people who simply didn't believe or obey God? Yeah. Okay, even moral people, by moral we mean by the world standards, who may have followed a law of morality, but because they didn't do what God told them to do, they will end up right there with Satan and his angels and all the worst of mankind. Because that's the issue of evil. There are no degrees of evil with God. Evil, evil, sin, sin. There's no degrees of it. There's degrees of consequence, but not degrees of sin or severity of sin. Doesn't exist. Anything else to that? Yes, sir.
In Genesis, God, or Joseph rather, he was ruler of Egypt, and his father died, and his brothers came to him, and they said, we're your servants. And then he responded, well, the evil that you did to me, God, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good.
Yeah.
And so, in that case, God took something evil and he turned it into good, i.e. fulfilled his ultimate purpose,
right,
his goals. So is evil all bad? It's a matter of perspective. If God uses it for good, if there's something evil, bad happens to us that's sinful,
yeah,
what are we going to look at that for? We're going to look at it as something bad or something that can be used for good.
I think, and perspective, I think, is the point there. Evil is still evil, okay? And it was the choice that those brothers made in selling Joseph, but ultimately, God brought about good. God knew what those brothers were going to do, and he brought about good not only for Joseph and for his brothers, but ultimately for Egypt, as well as ultimately how Israel was going to come about as well. But yeah, the perspective on how these things come about and utilizing those opportunities to show forth the character of God, being humble, being loving, being submissive. Those are the characteristics that Joseph showed. And those are the characteristics that even when evil is done to us, we have to show as well. Is that character, Joseph didn't go about saying, to his brothers, I hate you, I can't stand you, I don't want to be around you. It was all loving with Joseph. Why is the issue of free will so important, and how does love fit into this? Why is the issue of free will so important?
How can you love if you don't have a choice one way or the other?
Yeah. And if we're created in God's image, God isn't, and again, from the perspective of having the choice to do that which is right or wrong, God has given us that ability. God has given us the ability to make that determination. He created us with the ability to rationalize. Now, obviously, because Adam and Eve ate of the tree, the full knowledge of good and evil came in, but they still had the ability to understand right and wrong, even before the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. How do we know that? How do we know Adam and Eve knew right from wrong, to an extent, even before they ate of the tree? They knew full well. Okay? They knew. God says, don't eat of this tree. So at least in a limited capacity, they knew right from wrong. And at that point, there was only one wrong, which was to eat of that. No, do not eat of that tree. And so the understanding that they had the ability to make that choice, that God allowed them to have that ability to make that choice, and that he wants people to choose. In fact, regarding the prophecies of the covenant that he would make one day after the Mosaical law, how that those people would be volunteers. And instead of being written on tablets of stone, the law will be written on the tablets of their hearts. Okay, these are individuals who will choose to be his people. Why is God's justice so significant in helping answer the problem? What does God's justice guarantee in the end? So first of all, what does God's justice guarantee in the end?
Judgment and reckoning with people.
A day of reckoning. Does that mean God is going to just ignore all evil? So I mean, address that first. Just because God doesn't address it quickly enough for you doesn't mean he's not going to address it. Okay, God will bring every work into judgment. But why is God's justice so significant in helping to answer the problem of evil? This is free will is important. How is God's justice important? Okay, so there's the same standard being applied to all. The fact that God, being holy and just, demands that there will be consequence for right and wrong. Okay, or consequence for wrong specifically, reward for right. The fact that God's justice will not ignore evil. Okay, and to me that was a key phrase that Doy brings up. God's nature will not ignore evil. Okay, he will answer it. He did at times physically in the Old and New Testaments, but ultimately all evil will be dealt with one day. And that is a key component. Just because it doesn't happen as quickly as I want it or the way that I want it doesn't mean it won't. And it's arrogant to think that we should be able to tell God that this is how it needs to be. Noah?
From that very point, we look at huge evil things like come out in the news and think, why didn't God stop that, punish it? But if you would turn that back on us individually, for the things I've done in my life, would I wanted God to snap and I'm gone? Or
Oh, yeah.
we want that we get mercy and time.
Right. The ability to change and so forth. And sometimes we're not always given that. Some consequences of sin, okay, and I'm not speaking to Uzzah's ultimate spiritual destination because I don't know. I would hope that God would know Uzzah reacted trying to help. Okay, but even in Uzzah's immediate response, what happened? He was killed. He was struck dead. Nadab and Abihu, however, they were evil in their intentions. Okay, but did they have an opportunity to change after they offered profane fire before the Lord? No. And it just goes to show that some consequences are going to have immediate results. And you know, physically, some consequences have immediate results naturally. And okay, so that's the end of chapter 13. We'll finish next week with the kind of quote, which I think is really interesting. We'll get into chapter 14. Chapter 14 is the problem of hell and why many people, even who believe in God, don't believe that there is a hell, or if there is, God's going to send anybody there. We'll talk about that next week. Thanks, everybody.